welcome everybody to this session on Transimperial history, and I'm very happy to see a little bit different crowd than usually online. Some names I already know, but obviously the Italian Empire is a bit of a special case for many. I think for Transimperial history in many ways, or Transimperial history as such, was rather well received in Italy, because you can make the case to include an empire which is rather marginalized quite often in the broader literature. And so I'm very happy to see different faces here today. It's probably also due to the fact that this is not only a session of the series for Transimperial history. We had now, it's basically the third session in this semester already. We had, for example, Tom Menger, who was speaking about colonial violence, which is quite connected to what you are doing. But it's also a session on global fascism, a series which started this semester, and these are two topics I'm obviously quite involved in, but I think you are an expert who can speak to both of them, and I'm very much looking forward to this. So let me shortly introduce today's speaker, Emanuele Ertola. He's from Siena University. You see, founded very, very early. And he just joined us from Rome. He has a PhD from the Università degli Studi di Firenze in 2015, and the title was L'impero immaginario, I coloni italiani in Ethiopia. And this was then published some years later, I think, by Goracci in 2022. Is this one?
Another publisher, but
okay.
Don't worry about that.
Il colonialismo degli italiani.
Yeah, that's another book.
That's the okay. Yes. So was it published as In Terra d'Africa?
That one.
Okay. So I wanted to say it took quite a while to publish his dissertation, but then it was only 2 years, and he published it in 2017 with the title In Terra d'Africa, Italiani che colonizzarono l'imperio. So the Italian colonizer of the empire. And then he has a second book, 2022, and many articles I won't mention. And this, what you are presenting today, is some kind of project. You are involved in an Italian project looking at the Transimperial history of latecomer empires, and there you looked more to the how the Italians perceived the Japanese imperial expansion in the late 19th century. But today you will speak about the Italian colonial history in the broader context of Transimperial history, how far it is seen as a special case or not. Yeah, please, the floor is yours for 45 minutes.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roman. Thank you to the University of Leipzig for having invited me. I'm very happy to be here and share with you this research, even if these are mostly preliminary results, but it's probably something that we can discuss together after my presentation. So over the last 2 decades, historians of empire have increasingly moved beyond the study of colonial systems as separated and self-contained entities, influenced by global and transnational history, histoire croisée, and more recently by what Daniel Hedinger and Nadine Herd described as the Transimperial turn. Scholars have become increasingly interested in the circulation of people, ideas, practices, institutions, and technologies across imperial boundaries. Rather than treating empires as isolated political formations, this scholarship has highlighted the dense web of exchanges, collaboration, rivalries, borrowings, and this is what I want to particularly stress today, mutual observations. Colonial administrators learned from each other. Experts circulated between empires. Scientific knowledge, ideas, techniques, and models of governance traveled across colonial borders. In this perspective, empires appear less as separate units than as nodes within broader networks. Yet, despite the remarkable vitality of this field, the Italian colonial empire has occupied only a marginal position within the Transimperial literature. Italian colonial historiography has been profoundly renewed by post-colonial studies and by the new imperial history, but it has generally overlooked this new field and remained focused on the national framework, showing a relatively limited interest in trans-imperial connections. There are, of course, important exceptions. Several promising research projects are currently moving in this direction. Scholars working on tropical medicine, agronomy, environmental management, and scientific expertise, just to make some examples, are increasingly revealing how colonial knowledge circulated across imperial boundaries and how Italian colonial actors participated in wider international networks of exchange. These contributions remain relatively few in number for now, but they suggest the considerable potential of a trans-imperial perspective for rethinking Italian colonial history. And today I would like to rethink with you, or at least to start reconsidering, one of the most persistent categories in the history and historiography of Italian colonialism, that of exceptionalism. For a long time, Italian colonialism has been regarded as somehow distinct from the experience of other European empires. For decades, public discourse in post-war Italian Republic emphasized the supposedly moderate and benevolent character of Italian rule. Historians, too, have frequently emphasized its structural peculiarities. In particular, two elements have been repeatedly invoked: the late arrival of Italy into the imperial race, and the unusually rapid collapse of its empire during the Second World War. The first argument concerns chronology. Italy is commonly described as a latecomer among colonial powers. Having achieved national unification only in the second half of the 19th century, it entered overseas expansion after the major European empires had already established themselves. The Italian empire thus appears as a belated imperial project, born when the age of colonial expansion was already well underway. The second argument concerns duration. Compared to the British, French, Dutch, or Portuguese empires, Italian colonial rule appears remarkably brief. Between 1941 and 43, Italy lost all of its colonies as a consequence of military defeat, creating the impression of an empire that disappeared almost overnight. This apparent abruptness has often encouraged the perception that Italy experienced an exceptional form of decolonization, or no decolonization at all, seemingly different from the prolonged and frequently violent imperial withdrawals that characterized much of the post-war world. Yet, in recent years, these assumptions have come under increasing scrutiny by historians like Nicola Labanca, just to mention one of them. Consider, for example, the notion of Italy as a latecomer. Such a characterization appears less convincing when viewed from a broader comparative perspective. Much of the expansion that produced the French Empire in sub-Saharan Africa also occurred during the final decades of the 19th century. And similar observation could be made for Belgium or Germany as well. The category of latecomer may exaggerate Italy's actual chronological distance from other imperial powers. The same applies to the question of imperial collapse. Important parallels can be found in the collapse of German colonial empire after the First World War, and even more strikingly, in the dissolution of the Japanese empire after 1945. In both cases, imperial structure disappeared rapidly as a consequence of military defeat rather than through a long process of negotiated decolonization following the Anglo-French model. If recent scholarship has increasingly questioned the notion of Italian colonial exceptionalism, a different question remains largely unexplored. Rather than asking whether Italian colonialism was truly exceptional, we might ask how contemporaries themselves perceived Italy's place within the wider imperial world. From the very beginning, Italian colonial discourse developed through constant comparison with other imperial powers. Long before Italy acquired its first former colony in 1890, colonial enthusiasts, geographers, journalists, and explorers interpreted international affairs through a comparative lens, measuring Italian ambitions against the achievements of Britain, France, and other expanding powers. We certainly know that within the imperial cloud, not all empires carried the same weight, nor did all of them function as models in the same way. From the very beginning, for example, Italian colonialists looked with particular admiration at the British Empire, which was quite obviously the model par excellence. By contrast, when discussing France in 1881 and observing its efforts to expand its influence in Africa, commentators emphasized the novelty of the phenomenon. As one author noted, I quote, "The French were generally considered unsuited to establishing colonies, and in this respect had much to learn from their English neighbors." Yet, he argued, such assumption no longer reflected reality. The lessons for Italian was clear. Even a country long regarded as unsuited to colonial expansion could successfully embark upon the conquest of colonies. The following year, in 1882, the Italian government acquired its first colonial foothold, the small Red Sea port of Assab. During this early phase, however, Italian views of other empires were consistently shaped by the anxiety of a latecomer that was not doing enough and risked being left behind. Observing Dutch expansion in New Guinea in 1883, Italian colonial periodicals lamented that, I quote, "We see the world gradually dressing itself in the colors of great powers, even in places that until yesterday belonged to no one. It seemed that Italy too must set foot somewhere," end of quote. The contrast between Italy and the other imperial powers was a recurring theme. While other European nations are not sleeping, Italians, by contrast, seemed content with symbolic achievements. I quote, "We remain content admiring our Assab as a child admires his toy." Within this comparative imagination, Germany occupied a special place. Unlike Britain or France, it had itself only recently become a unified nation state. Its success, therefore, carried an implicit message for Italian observers. If another newly unified country could rapidly establish a colonial empire, Italy's hesitation appeared increasingly difficult to justify. When Germany acquired the first African bases in early 1880s, Italian commentators observed, I quote, "And now Germany joins France, England, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Without making noise for 10 years, without publishing volumes, Germany has established a firm foothold in Africa, in a possession far larger and better than Assab." What then seems to characterize the Italian gaze during this earliest phase? First, a clear anxiety produced by the contrast between the dynamism of other powers and the perceived slowness and passivity of Italy. Second, a particular admiration for Germany, because Germany was perceived as sharing important characteristics with Italy. It was explicitly presented as a model to follow. I quote, these are ideas better suited to our own conditions and tradition than French bravado or British omnipotence. Let the Italian government, like the German one, support private associations and commercial enterprises, and perhaps we too shall succeed in securing our place in the sun. So do as the Germans are doing, and we will succeed. In this early phase, then, comparison served above all as a language of learning. Italian colonialists looked outward in search of examples to emulate, and Germany in particular appeared to demonstrate that a newly unified nation could rapidly transform itself into an imperial power if it possessed sufficient determination, organization, and political will. The acquisition of Eritrea in 1890 and the traumatic defeat at Adwa in 1896 did not diminish the importance of the transimperial comparisons within Italian colonial discourse. On the contrary, they made them even more central. If the colonial literature of the 1880s had been dominated by the question of how Italy might enter the imperial race, the turn of the century then witnessed a more complex effort to assess Italy's actual position within the hierarchy of the colonial powers. A revealing example can be found in the reactions to the South African War. Commenting on the widespread tendency to compare Britain's conduct during the Boer War with Italy's behavior after the defeat of Adwa, one of these Italian journals, called L'Esplorazione Commerciale, criticized what they regarded as a superficial comparison. Many observers, they noted, praised, I quote, the tenacious British calm in facing the enormous sacrifices of war and the repeated serious reverses suffered by its armies, while contrasting it with our weakness and resignation after the defeat against Ethiopia. Yet such judgments ignore what they call the enormous difference in conditions between the two countries. Of course, what Italy needed, the article continued, was above all, I quote, an exact knowledge of our actual and relative potentiality in the concert and competition among the most important civilized nations. It is particularly interesting because despite the disastrous defeat at Adwa, which from the Italian perspective had brought colonial expansion to a halt, at least temporarily, Italian colonial discourse did not retreat into isolation or introspection. Instead, colonial commentators continue to see themselves and to measure themselves as participants in the great imperial competition. A particular revealing source for this period is a report published by one of these colonial journals in occasion of the Paris Universal Exposition. Such exhibitions were, of course, much more than commercial or cultural events. They were spaces in which empires displayed themselves, exhibited their achievements, and invited comparison. For Italian observers, the Paris Exposition offered a unique opportunity to undertake precisely this exercise. Moving from one colonial pavilion to another, the journalist Antonio Annoni effectively guided his readers through a comparative tour of the imperial world. Every empire became an object of evaluation. Every display provided an occasion to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of different colonial systems. The question was never simply what France, Britain, Germany, or Portugal were doing in their colonies, but what Italy could learn from their experiences and how it measured up against them. As in much of the colonial literature of the period, Britain occupied the summit of the hierarchy. Visiting the British pavilion, Annoni exclaimed, I quote, "How much the Latin people still have to learn by studying these English colonies. Even France itself, which occupies more than half of the colonial exhibition at the Trocadero, still has a long road ahead before it can equal the English, the Germans, and the Dutch." This remark is revealing because it situates Italy within a broader family of Latin nations while simultaneously acknowledging the superiority of Northern European colonial powers. Britain remained the principal model, but Germany and the Netherlands increasingly appeared as successful examples as well. Commenting on the weaknesses of these Latin empires, above all Portugal, whose, I quote, greatest mistake was to neglect these African colonies completely, the journalist concluded with a phrase that encapsulated much of the competitive ethos of European imperialism. I quote, "Unfortunately, the world belongs to the strong." In the early years of the 20th century, another type of article became particularly common. Essays that attempted to offer a broader reflection on the previous century and on Italy's place within the emerging global order. Through these turn-of-the-century assessments, colonial expansion was no longer discussed merely as a future aspiration. Instead, it increasingly came to be understood as a historical process that could be studied, measured, evaluated, and compared across different imperial experiences. One of the most ambitious attempts to do so was a long article named Trentennio Coloniale, 30 Years of Colonialism, 1870-1900, published in 1903. The article offered a panoramic survey of the transformations that had reshaped the imperial world during the previous 3 decades and sought to draw lessons from them for Italian readers. The journalist opened his survey by emphasizing the unprecedented scale of European expansion during the late 19th century. I quote, "Perhaps there is no parallel in human history to the immense development achieved by the white race across the globe during the last 30 years, a development intellectual, scientific, industrial, and commercial in nature. As soon as old Europe put an end to its internal political convulsions, we see all European peoples striving to move beyond the natural frontiers assigned to them by geography or politics. Faced with the decline of Spain, what a remarkable example is offered by Great Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, to mention only the modern colonial giants." The purpose of this survey was openly pedagogical. The transformations of the previous 30 years deserve to be studied so that Italians might understand the economic foundations and political foundations of imperial expansions and learn from the achievements of the most successful colonial powers. I quote, "These developments should be carefully studied so that Italians may become convinced of two things. First, the desirability among us of a greater knowledge and understanding of such economic factors. Second, that the colonial achievements of other nations should serve as an example to Italians." The first and most important model was, unsurprisingly, again, the British Empire. I quote, "Albion teaches everyone," the author writes, and despite some anxiety, he also writes, "Its growth has been so vast that it must truly intimidate every other European people. Were this absorption of the globe by the Anglo-Saxon to continue, one might almost foresee that not distant day when London could dictate laws to all the people of the universe." But despite this anxiety, the conclusion remains firmly within the language of learning. I quote, "The British people nevertheless remain, taken as a whole, worthy of admiration and imitation for what they have accomplished during the last 30 years. France offered a different lesson. It lacked settlers but possessed capital, long-term planning, and confidence in colonial investment." I quote, "They have broad vision and, like the English and the Germans, know how to wait for the fruits of their investments at the appropriate moment." Then the author turned more briefly to the Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish cases. But the most relevant comparisons concern what the author called the new nations in the colonial arena: Germany, the United States, and Belgium. Germany attracted, again, particular admiration because, I quote, "Within a few years, without attracting too much attention from its suspicious rivals, created for itself a vast colonial empire, truly worthy of envy and even more of study." After reviewing Germany's possessions, the article described the Germans as, I quote, "a young but vigorous people, bold, tenacious, and broad-minded, whom we too must study and imitate." That's the key point. Italians continued to perceive themselves as latecomers. I quote again, "We were neither sufficiently prudent nor sufficiently bold when it was easy to act. Now we see the whole world appropriated by the Anglo-Germans, the French, and the Russians. What remains today upon which we may cast our eyes and our desires?" But the lesson to be drawn from the previous 30 years was that Italy had to learn from more successful powers. In liberal Italy, after 3 decades of colonial debate, the solution to Italian weakness was the patient study of foreign experiences and the adoption of practices that had already proven successful elsewhere. Comparison remained fundamentally a language of learning. This approach changes with fascism, but it changes slowly and gradually. Let's move fast forward. By 1929, the context has changed profoundly. Italy was no longer an aspiring colonial power. It possessed Eritrea, Somalia, had conquered Libya nearly 2 decades earlier, and was engaged in the final and most violent phase of the campaign against anti-colonial resistance in Cyrenaica. At the same time, fascism had transformed colonial expansion into one of the central pillars of national policy. Yet, the comparative gaze remained remarkably persistent. What changed was the position from which Italian colonialists observed other empires, no longer standing outside the imperial system and lamenting Italy's lateness. They now discuss colonial questions as members of the club of imperial powers. In this space, other empires may still function as a benchmark of colonial achievement. Listen how French Algeria was described by a fascist colonialist magazine in 1930. I quote, 20 years ago, I remember having expressed to a Sicilian sea captain sailing for Algiers my desire to embark on his picturesque vessel in order to see what this blessed Orient was like. The good man burst out laughing and replied that there was no longer any Orient in Algiers. If there was none then, imagine now. Now in Algiers, there is America. You may arrive in Algeria determined to undertake nothing more than a sentimental journey in search of fiery sunsets, minarets, caravans, belly dances, and the like. 24 hours setting foot on Algiers, your thirst for local color has vanished, overcome by a disconcerting and almost scandalous thirst for statistics, figures. Figures, that is the true marvel of contemporary Algeria. The true spectacle for a fascist in 1930 in Algeria is roads, automobiles, communications, and economic indicators. It is also interesting that in the early 1930s, the fascist journal L'Oltremare published a huge comparative survey of how different empires improved colonial propaganda. Portugal, the Netherlands, Britain, France all became case studies. The issue was no longer only how to conquer or administer colonies, but how to make empire part of the metropolitan life. Writing on Portuguese colonial propaganda, the author praised a system that, I quote, although not as grandiose as the French or German examples, is extremely active and deserves to be known for its true value. About the Dutch case, he writes, the methods and system of colonial propaganda in the Netherlands teaches many things to us who are still at the beginning of our work. And there were also articles on the British, the French, so on. What I want to highlight is that fascist colonial discourse did not abandon transimperial comparison all of a sudden. The crucial difference with the past is that comparison no longer served primarily to explain Italian weaknesses. It served to strengthen an imperial project that fascism now regarded as mature, necessary, and central to the national destiny. But Italy was still learning from other empires. The invasion of Ethiopia and the proclamation of empire in 1936 marked a final turning point. From that moment onward, the regime increasingly sought to present its colonial project not simply as one imperial system among others, but as a fundamentally new form of empire. There's nothing more to learn from the others. Now it's time to teach the others. The final group of sources I would like to discuss comes from the late 1930s and illustrates how fascist Italy attempted to construct and promote an image of imperial originality within a world already dominated by much older and larger colonial powers. Fascist colonial discourse did not abandon comparison. Rather, it used comparison to establish difference. The Italian Empire was constantly measured against other imperial experiences, particularly the British one, but the purpose of that comparison had changed. What emerges repeatedly from the colonial press is the insistence on novelty. Fascist commentators describe the empire as, I quote, a typical form of colonization, pride and glory of Italy. They celebrated, I quote, the novelty and originality of the fascist colonial doctrine inspired and directed by the genius of the Duce, and claimed that, I quote, nothing like this has ever been done in the colonies. In 1939, another journal described fascist colonization as, I quote, a real milestone in the form of a settler colonialism to which Italy adds completely original means, methods, and actions. While another author asserted that, I quote, no foreign people without exclusion has been able to study, organize, and implement mass colonization in the way Mussolini's Italy did. The claim was unmistakable. Italian colonialism was not merely successful, it was fundamentally new. What then was supposed to distinguish it from the previous colonial experiences? The answer lay in the contrast between what fascist ideologues described as the old colonialism of merchants, adventurers, and economic exploitation, and the new model centered on organized settlement. One commentator explained, I quote, there have never been qualified, selected, ethnically homogeneous, disciplined, and supervised masses departing from the motherland to implement a rational system of land transformation, since it is not a colonization in the old way, white adventurers left alone, or the exploitation of indigenous energies, but rather a new phenomenon in African and world history. Another defined fascist colonization as, I quote, the overseas projection of all the productive elements of a great nation, above all our demographic energies capable of renewal and multiplication, an organic extension of the peninsula beyond the seas in the specifically Roman sense of civilization transplant. This is undoubtedly the unmistakable hallmark of fascist imperialism. I could continue. There are many other examples like this, but it's pretty clear, I think. Fascists claim to have invented state-supported settler colonialism. The paradox, of course, is that what fascists described as a revolutionary innovation was in reality one of the oldest and most widespread forms of colonial expansion in modern world. Settler colonialism had already been practiced on a massive scale by the British, French, and even state-sponsored settlement schemes were not an Italian invention. They have been experimented in different contexts. And let's just think about the Japanese Millions to Manchuria program in the same years. Yet, this contradiction did not weaken the fascist argument, developed above all through comparison with the British Empire, which became the principal negative reference point. British expansion, colonial writers argued, had been driven by speculators rather than by settlers. I quote, the British Empire was born not from the fruitful impulse of a people in need of expansion, but from the enterprises of an elite of ruthless pirates and greedy merchants. Its settler society themselves were dismissed as inadequate. I quote, the British Empire's population was in progressive decline, with colonial territories economically exploited but left almost deserted. Even where, and this is probably my favorite quotation, I find it very funny, even where substantial settler populations exist, fascist commentators minimize their significance. True, there were 2 million whites in South Africa, but half were Boers, prolific and hard-working race. In Australia, there were about 7 million settlers, but they had come driven by greed only after the discovery of the gold. In Canada, there were 11 million settlers, but mostly French. Nothing, they argued, could compare with Italy. Nothing. For years, Italian colonialists had admired the demographic vitality of foreign settler societies, from Algeria to South Africa. Now, those same examples were reinterpreted in order to demonstrate the uniqueness and originality of the Italian case. So, to conclude, what then can we learn from these sources? First, they confirm that the observation of other colonial empires was not an occasional practice, but a pervasive and remarkably persistent feature of colonial thought. Throughout the period examined here, Italian colonialists constantly looked outward. They interpreted their own successes, failures, ambitions, and anxieties through the lens of other imperial experiences. More importantly, this comparative gaze was not static. It evolved alongside Italy's changing position within the imperial world. Comparison accompanied the entire history of Italian colonialism, but it did so in different ways at different times. The Italian case is particularly revealing in this respect. During the liberal period, the perception of Italy as a latecomer profoundly shaped colonial discourse. The dominant assumption was that Italy had much to learn from those powers that had entered the imperial race earlier and more successfully. The shadow of Adwa played a crucial role in reinforcing this attitude. The traumatic defeat of 1896 haunted Italian colonial discourse for decades. Again and again, Italian commentators measured their country's weaknesses against the apparent successes of rival empires. Comparison became a way of understanding failure, identifying deficiency, and imagining possible paths towards imperial maturity. The language that dominates these texts is therefore one of study, emulation, and learning. A second final thought concerns the Fascist period. What emerges from this text is not an immediate rupture following the March on Rome in 1922, but a gradual transformation. The comparative framework remained remarkably stable throughout the 1920s and even into the early 1930s. Italian colonial press continued to study foreign empires, to analyze their institutions, and to search for lessons that could be applied to the Italian case. The real turning point came later, culminating in the Ethiopian War and the proclamation of the empire in 1936. Only then we do see a profound shift in colonial self-perception. The Italy that had long presented itself as a weak and belated imperial power gradually reimagined itself as a strong and innovative one. The empire that had spent decades learning from others now claimed to possess lessons of its own to teach to the others. Correspondingly, the function of comparison changed. Foreign empires ceased to be primarily models for imitation and increasingly became examples of inefficiency, decline, and failure. The very powers that earlier generations had admired, above all Britain and France, were now portrayed as exhausted democracies incapable of solving the problems that fascist colonialism allegedly addressed successfully. At the same time, what I have presented today can only be considered a first exploration of a much broader problem. One obvious avenue for future research would be to examine how this comparative perspective varied across the political positioning of the observers themselves. Did liberals, nationalists, conservatives, or administrators, military officers, intellectuals compare Italy to other empires exactly the same way? Or did they construct different imperial geographies and identify different models? The sources suggest that the answers may be more complex than the overview presented here allows us to see. Moreover, the material discussed today comes mainly from journals that reflected on colonialism at the general level, offering broad overviews of foreign empires and Italy's position within the imperial world, but what happened in the more specialized literature? Did geographers, agronomists, tropical medicine experts, or engineers, or colonial scientists observe other empires through the same comparative lens? And did they reach the same conclusions? And there are other questions. If we have examined how Italians looked at other empires, we know much less about how other empires looked at Italy. We know that fascist colonial experiments attracted considerable international attention. British, French, German observers followed developments in Libya and later in Ethiopia closely. Patrick Bernhardt's work has shown, for example, the extent to which Germany looked at Italian colonial practices as a source of inspiration. Similar forms of interest can also be found among British observers, but here another question emerges. To what extent was the perception of Italian originality genuine, and to what extent was it shaped by the success of fascist propaganda itself? After all, one of the regime's central objectives was precisely to convince both domestic and foreign foreign audiences that fascism had created a new form of imperialism, distinguishing between actual foreign perceptions and the image that fascism sought to project remains an important task for future research. Finally, large parts of the story remain almost entirely unexplored. We know relatively little about how Belgian, Dutch, Portuguese colonial circles perceived Italian empire. Comparative studies remain scarce, and the international circulation of representations of Italian colonialism is still only partially understood. I'm aware that I'm leaving you with more questions than answers, but it is perhaps inevitable when entering a relatively new historiographical territory. What I offer today is only a preliminary exploration, yet even this brief survey suggests two broader conclusions. The first is that colonial empires constantly thought about themselves in relational terms. They did not develop in isolation. Their administrators, intellectuals, journalists, and policymakers observed one another, borrowed from one another, competed with one another, and defined themselves through one another. The second conclusion is that the Italian case strongly supports one of the central intuitions of the Transimperial approach. Empires should not be studied as self-contained worlds. They are better understood as nodes within a larger and constantly shifting networks of interaction. Their position within that network changes over time, and so do the meanings they attribute to themselves and to the others. Seen from this perspective, Italian colonial exceptionalism appears less as a fixed characteristic of the Italian empire than as a historical construction produced through decades of comparisons, observations, rivalry, and exchange. And perhaps this is the most important lesson that a transimperial reading of Italian colonialism can offer. Thank you.